Hey everyone, my name is Banu, and here's part 2 of Ancient Mediterranean Ships. The Temple of Deir el-Bahari contained also a most interesting illustrated account of the transport of two great obelisks down the Nile in the reign of the same queen. Unfortunately, parts of the description and of the carvings have been lost, but enough remains to give us a very clear idea of the vessels employed and of the method of transport. Figure 5 shows a type of barge employed to carry the obelisks, of which there were two. The dotted lines show the portions of the carving which are at present missing. The restoration was effected by Monsieur Edouard Naville. The restoration is by no means conjectural. The key to it was furnished by a hieroglyph in the form of the barge with the obelisks on deck. Some of these obelisks were of very large size. There are two, which are hewn out of granite for Queen Hatshepsut, still at the Temple of Karnak. They may very possibly be the two which are referred to in the description of Deir el-Bahari. One of them is 98 feet and the other 105 feet in height. The larger of the two has been calculated to weigh 374 tons, and the two together may have weighed over 700 tons. To transport such heavy stones, very large barges would have been required. Unfortunately, the greater portion of the inscription describing the buildings of these boats has been lost. But what remains states that orders were given to collect sycamores from the whole land to do the work of building a very great boat. There is, however, an inscription still intact in the tomb of an ancient Egyptian named Anna, who lived in the reigns of the three kings Thutmose, and therefore also during that of Queen Hatshepsut, which relates that, having to transport two obelisks for Thutmose I, he built a boat 120 cubits long and 40 cubits wide, with the royal cubit of 72 inches was referred to. The dimensions of the boat would have been 200 feet long by 69 feet wide. This is possibly the very boat illustrated on the walls of Deir el-Bahari, for it having evidently been a matter of some difficulty to collect the timber necessary to build so large a vessel. It seems only natural to suppose that it would be carefully preserved for the future transport of similar obelisks. If, however, it was found necessary to construct a new boat in order to transport Queen Hatshepsut's obelisks, we may be fairly certain that it was larger than the one whose dimensions are given above, for the taller of her two obelisks at Karnak is the largest that has been found in Egypt in modern times. The obelisk of rose granite of Thutmose I, still at Karnak, is 35 feet shorter, being 70 feet, or exactly the same height as the one called Cleopatra's Needle, now on the Thames embankment. The barge shown in Figure 5 was strengthened, apparently, with 3 tiers of beams. It was steered by 2 pairs of huge steering oars and was towed by 3 parallel groups, each consisting of 10 large boats. There were 32 oarsmen to each boat in the 2 wing groups and 36 in each of the central groups. There were exactly 1,000 oars used in all. The towing cable started from the masthead of the foremost boat of each group, and thence passed to the bow of the second one, and so on, the stern of each boat being left perfectly free, for the purpose, no doubt, of facilitating the steering. The flotilla was accompanied by 5 smaller boats, some of which were used by the priests, while the others were dispatch vessels, probably used to keep up with communications with the group of tugs. There are no other inscriptions or carvings that have as yet been discovered in Egypt, which gives us so much information regarding Egyptian ships as those on the temple at Deir el-Bahari. From time to time we read of naval and mercantile expeditions, but illustrations of the ships and details of the voyages are as a rule wanting. We know that Seti I of the 19th dynasty, whose reign commenced about in 1366 BC, was a great encourager of commerce. He felled timber in Lebanon for building ships, and is said to have excavated a canal between the Nile and the Red Sea. His successor, the famous Ramses II, carried on wars by sea, as is proved by the inscriptions in the temple at Abu Simbel in Nubia, 762 miles above Cairo. In the records of the reign of Ramses III, 1200 BC, we come again upon illustrations of ships in the Temple of Victory at Medinet Habu, West Thebes. The inscriptions describe a great naval victory which this king won at Migdol, near the Palisaic mouth of the Nile, over northern invaders, probably Colchians and Carians. Figure 6 shows one of those battleships. It is probably more symbolical than an exact representation. Nevertheless, it gives us some valuable information. For instance, we see that the rowers were protected against the missiles of their adversaries by strong bulwarks, and the captain occupied a crow's nest at the masthead. Ramses III did a great deal to develop Egyptian commerce. His naval activities were by no means confined to the Mediterranean, for we read that he built a fleet at Suez and traded with the land of Punt and the shores of the Indian Ocean. Herodotus states that in his day, the docks still existed at the head of the Arabian Gulf where this Red Sea fleet was built. Pharaoh Necho, who reigned from 612 to 596 BC and who defeated Josiah, king of Judah, was one of the kings of Egypt who did most to encourage commerce. He commenced a canal to join the Palisaic branch of the Nile at Bubastis with the Red Sea, but never finished it. It was under his directions that the Phoenicians, according to Herodotus, made the voyage around Africa referred to on page 27. When Necho abandoned the construction of the canal, he built 2 fleets of triremes, one for use in the Mediterranean and the other for the Red Sea. The latter fleet was built in the Arabian Gulf. In later times, the seaborne commerce of Egypt fell, to a large extent, into the hands of the Phoenicians and Greeks. Herodotus gives an interesting account of the Nile boats of his day, and of the method of navigation of the river. Their boats, with which they carry cargoes, are made of the thorny acacia. From this tree, they cut pieces of wood about 2 cubits in length, and arrange them like bricks, fastening the boat together by a great number of long bolts to the 2-cubit pieces, and when they have thus fastened the boat together, they lay cross pieces over the top, using no ribs for the sides, and within they caulk the seams with papyrus. They make 1 steering oar for it, which is passed through the bottom of the boat, and they have a mast of acacia and sails of papyrus. These boats cannot sail up the river unless there is a very fresh wind blowing, but are towed. Downstream they travel as follows. They have a door-shaped crate made of tamarisk wood and reed mats sewn together, and also a stone of about 2 talents weight, bored with a hole, and of these the boatman lets the crate float on in front of the boat, fastened with a rope, and the stone dragged behind by another rope. The crate then, as the force of the stream presses upon it, goes on swiftly and draws on the boats, while the stone dragging after it behind and sunk deep in the water keeps its course straight. In connection with this account, it is curious to note that at so late a period as the time of Herodotus, papyrus was used for the sails of Nile boats, for we know that for many centuries previously, the Egyptians were adepts in the manufacture of linen and actually exported fine linen to Cyprus to be used as sailcloth. Before concluding this account of shipbuilding in ancient Egypt, it may be mentioned that in the year 1894, the French Egyptologist Monsieur J. de Morgan discovered several Nile boats at the time of the 12th century of the 12th dynasty, 2850 BCE to be exact, admirably preserved in brick vaults at Dashur, a little above Cairo on the left bank of the river. The site of these vaults is about 1 hour's ride from the river and between 70 and 80 feet above the plain. The boats are about 33 feet long, 7 to 8 feet wide, and 2.5 to 3 feet deep. As there were neither rowlocks nor masts, and as they were found in close proximity to some royal tombs, it is considered probable that they were funeral boats, used for carrying royal mummies across the river. They are constructed of planks of acacia and sycamore about 3 inches thick, which are dovetailed together and fastened with tree nails. There are floors, but no ribs. In this respect, the account of Herodotus is remarkably confirmed. The method of construction was so satisfactory that although they are nearly 5,000 years old, they held rigidly together after their supports had been removed by Monsieur de Morgan. They were steered by two large paddles. The discovery of these boats is of extraordinary interest, for they were built at the period usually assigned to Noah's Ark. It is a curious fact that they should have been found so far from the river, but we know from other sources, such as the paintings found in papyrus books, that it was the custom of the people to transport the mummies of royal personages together with the funeral boats on sledges to the tomb. The famous galleys of the Egypt of the Ptolemies belong to the period of Greek and Roman naval architecture and will be referred to later. From the time of the ancient Egyptian vessels, there is no record whatever of the progress of naval architecture until we come to the period of the Greeks, and even the early records relating to this country are meager in the extreme. The Phoenicians were among the first of the races who dwelt on the Mediterranean seaboard to cultivate a seaborne commerce, and to them, after the Egyptians, is undoubtedly due to the early progress made in sea-going ships. This remarkable people is said to have originally come to the Levant from the shores of the Persian Gulf. They occupied a strip of territory on the seaboard to the north of Palestine, about 250 miles long and of the average width of only 12 miles. The chief cities were Tyre and Sidon. There are only 3 representations known to be in existence of the Phoenician ships. They must have been of considerable size and have been well manned and equipped, for the Phoenicians traded with every part of the known world, and founded colonies, the principal of which was Carthage, at many places along the coastline of the Mediterranean. A proof of the size and seaworthiness of their ships was the fact that they made very distant voyages across notoriously stormy seas. For instance, to Cornwall in search of tin, and probably also to the south coast of Ireland. They also coasted along the western shores of Africa. Somewhere between the years 610 and 594 BC, some Phoenician ships, acting under instructions from Pharaoh Necho, are said to have circumnavigated Africa, having proceeded from the Indian to the Southern Ocean, and thence round by the Atlantic and through the Pillars of Hercules home. The voyage occupied more than 2 years, a circumstance which was due to the fact that they always landed in the autumn and sowed a tract of country with corn, and waited on shore till it was fit to cut. In the time of Solomon, the joint fleets of the Israelites and the Phoenicians made voyages from the head of the Red Sea down to the coast of Arabia and eastern Africa, and even to Persia and Beluchistan, and probably also to India. The Phoenicians were not only great traders themselves, but they manned the fleets of other nations and built ships for other peoples, notably for the Egyptians and Persians. It is unfortunate that we have so few representations of the Phoenician ships, but we are justified in concluding that they were of the same general type as those which were used by their Greeks, the Carthaginians, and eventually by the Romans. The representations of their vessels, known to be in existence, were found by the late Sir Austin Layard in the palace built by King Sennacherib at Koyunjik, near Nineveh, about 700 BC. One of those is shown in Figure 7. Though they were obviously rather symbols of ships than faithful representations, we can nevertheless gather from them that the warship was a galley provided with a ram, and fitted with a mast, carrying a single square sail. There were also 2 banks of oars on each side. The steering was accomplished by 2 large oars at the stern, and the fighting troops were carried on deck, or platform, raised on pillars above the heads of the rowers. In considering the history of the development of shipbuilding, we cannot fail to be struck with the favorable natural conditions which existed in Greece for the improvement of the art. On the east and west, the mainland was bordered by inland seas, studded with the islands abounding in harbors. Away to the northeast were other enclosed seas, which tempted the enterprise of early navigators. One of the cities of Greece proper, Corinth, occupied an absolutely unique position for trade and colonization, situated as it was on the narrow isthmus commanding 2 seas. The long, narrow Gulf of Corinth, opening into the Mediterranean and giving access to the Ionian Islands, must have been a veritable nursery of the art of navigation, for here the early traders could sail for long distances in easy conditions without losing sight of land. The Gulf of Aegina and the waters of the archipelago were equally favorable. The instincts of the people were commercial, and their necessities made them colonizers on a vast scale. Moreover, they had at their disposal the experience and the arts of navigation acquired from time immemorial by the Egyptians and Phoenicians. Nevertheless, with all these circumstances in their favors, the Greeks, at any rate up to the 4th century, appear to have contributed nothing to the improvement of shipbuilding. The Egyptians and Phoenicians both built triremes as early as 600 BC, but this class of vessel was quite the exception in the Greek fleets which fought at Salamis 120 years later. The earliest naval expedition mentioned in Greek history is that of the Allied fleets which transported the armies of Hellas to the siege of Troy about the year 1237 BC. According to Greek historians, the vessels used were open boats, decks not having been introduced into Greek vessels until a much later period. The earliest Greek naval battle of which we have any record took place about the year 709 BC, over 500 years after the expedition to Troy, and 1,000 years after the battle depicted in the Temple of Victory at Thebes. It was fought between the Corinthians and their rebellious colonists of Corsica, now called Corfu. Some of the naval expeditions recorded in Greek history were conceived on a gigantic scale. The joint fleets of Persia and Phoenicia, which attacked and conquered the Greek colonies in Ionia, consisted of 600 vessels. This expedition took place in the year 496 BC. Shortly afterwards, the Persian commander-in-chief Mardonius collected a much larger fleet for the invasion of Greece itself. After the death of Cambyses, his successor Xerxes collected a fleet which is stated to have numbered 4,200 vessels, of which 1,200 were triremes. The remainder appears to have been divided into two classes, of which the larger were propelled with 25 and the smaller with 15 oars a side. This fleet, after many misfortunes at sea and after gaining a hard-fought victory over the Athenians, was finally destroyed by the united Greek fleet at the ever-famous Battle of Salamis. The size of the Persian monarch's fleet was in itself a sufficient proof of the extent of naval power of the Levantine states, but an equally convincing proof of the maritime power of another Mediterranean state, Carthage. At that early period, about 470 BCE, is forthcoming. This state equipped a large fleet consisting of almost 3,000 ships against the Greek colonies. In Sicily, of those, 2,000 were fighting galleys, and the remainder transports on which no less than 300,000 men were embarked. This mighty armada was partly destroyed in a great storm. All the transports were wrecked, and the galleys were attacked and totally destroyed by the fleets of the Greek colonists under Galon on the very day, according to tradition, on which the Persians were defeated at Salamis. Out of the entire expedition, a few persons returned to Carthage to tell the tale of their disasters. The foregoing account will serve to give a fair idea of the extent to which shipbuilding was carried on in the Mediterranean in the 5th century before the Christian era. We have very little knowledge of the nature of Greek vessels previously to 500 BC. Thucydides says that the ships engaged on the Trojan expedition were without decks. According to Homer, 1,200 ships were employed, those of the Boeotians having 120 men each, and those of Philoctetes 50 men each. Thucydides also relates that the earliest Hellenic triremes were built at Corinth, and that Amenoocles, a Corinthian naval architect, built 4 ships for the Samians about 700 BC. But triremes did not become common until the time of the Persian War, except in Sicily and Corfu, in which states considerable numbers were in use a little time before the war broke out. An illustration of a single-banked Greek galley of the date about 500 BC, taken from an Athenian painted vase now in the British Museum. This is a description of figure 8. The vessel was armed with a ram. 17 oars a side are shown. There is no space on the vase to show in detail the whole of the mast and of rigging, but their presence is indicated by lines. Figure 9 is a description of a Greek bireme of about the date 500 BC, that is to say, of the period immediately preceding the Persian War. It is taken from a Greek vase in the British Museum, which was found at Volsci in Etruria. It is one of the very few representations now in existence of ancient Greek biremes. It gives us far less information than we would wish to have. The vessel has two banks of oars, those of the upper tier passing over the gunwale, those of the lower passing through oar ports. 20 oars are shown by the artist on each side, but this is probably not the exact number used. Unfortunately, the rowers of the lower tier are not shown in position. The steering was effected by means of two large oars at the stern, after the manner of those used in the Egyptian ships previously described. This is proved by another illustration of a bireme on the same vase in which the steering oars are clearly seen. The vessel had a strongly marked forecastle and a ram fashioned in the shape of a boar's head. It is a curious fact that Herodotus, in his history, Book the Third, mentions that the Samian ships carried beaks, formed to resemble the head of a wild boar, and he relates how the Aeginetans beat some Samian colonists in a sea fight off of Crete, and sawed off the boarhead beaks from the captured galleys and deposited them in a temple in Aegina. This sea fight took place about the same time that the vases were manufactured, from which figures 8 and 9 are copied. There was a single mast with a very large yard carrying a square sail. The stays are not shown, but Homer says that the masts of early Greek vessels were stayed fore and aft. Figure 10 is a fragment of a Greek galley showing an absence of the deck. It is impossible to say whether this vessel was decked. According to Thucydides, the ships which the Athenians built at the instigation of Themistocles, and which they used as salamis, were not fully decked. That Greek galleys were sometimes without decks is proved by Figure 10, which is a copy of a fragment of a painting of a Greek galley on an Athenian vase, which is now in the British Museum, and it dates to about 550 BC. It is perfectly obvious from the human figures in the galley that there was no deck. Not even the forecastle was covered in. The galleys of figures 8 and 9 had, unlike the Phoenician bireme of figure 7, no fighting deck for the use of soldiers. There was also no protection for the upper tier rowers, and in this respect they were inferior to the Egyptian ships shown in figure 6. It is probable that Athenian ships at Salamis also had no fighting or flying decks for the use of the soldiers, for according to Thucydides, Glypos, when exhorting the Syracusans nearly 60 years later, in 413 BCE, said, "But to them, the Athenians, the employment of troops on deck is a novelty." Against this view, however, it must be stated that there are now in existence at Rome two grotesque pictures of Greek galleys on a painted vase, dating from about 550 BC, in which the soldiers are clearly depicted standing and fighting upon a flying deck. Moreover, Thucydides, in describing a sea fight between the Corinthians and the Corcyraeans in 432 BC, mentions that the decks for both fleets were crowded with heavy infantry archers and javelin men, for their naval engagements were still of the old clumsy sort. Possibly this last sentence gives us a clue to the explanation of the apparent discrepancy. The Athenians were, as we know, expert tacticians at sea, and adopted the method of ramming hostile ships, instead of laying alongside and leaving the fighting to the troops on board. They may, however, have been forced to revert to the latter method in order to provide for cases where ramming could not be used, as for instance in the narrow harbors crowded with shipping like that of Syracuse. It is perfectly certain that the Phoenician ships, which formed the most important part of the Persian fleet at Salamis, carried fighting decks. We have seen already, on page 28, that they used such decks in the time of Sennacherib, and we have the distinct authority of Herodotus for the statement that they were also employed in the Persian War. For he relates that Xerxes returned to Asia in a Phoenician ship, and that great danger arose during a storm, the vessel having been top-heavy, owed to the deck being crowded with Persian nobles who returned with the king. Figure 11 shows a galley showing a deck and a superstructure, and it is from around 600 BC. Figure 11, which represents a bireme taken from an ancient Etruscan imitation of a Greek vase of about 600 BC, clearly shows soldiers fighting both on the deck proper and on a raised or flying forecastle. In addition to triremes, of which not a single illustration of earlier date than the Christian era is known to be in existence, both Greeks and Persians during the wars in the early part of the 5th century BC used 50-oared ships called Pentaconters, in which the oars were supposed to have been arranged in one tier. About a century and a half after the Battle of Salamis in 330 BC, the Athenians commenced to build ships with 4 banks, and 5 years later they advanced to 5 banks. This is proved by the extant inventories of the Athenian dockyards. According to Diodorus, they were in use in the Syracusan fleet in 398 BC. Diodorus, however, died nearly 350 years later after this epoch, and his account must therefore be received with caution. The evidence in favor of the existence of galleys having more than 5 superimposed banks of oars is very slight. Alexander the Great is said by most of his biographers to have used ships with 5 banks of oars, but Quintus Curtius states that in 323 BCE, the Macedonian king built a fleet of 7-banked galleys on the Euphrates. Quintus Curtius is supposed by the best authorities to have lived 5 centuries after the time of Alexander, and therefore his account of these ships cannot be accepted without question. It is also related by Diodorus that there were ships of 6 and 7 banks in the fleet of Demetrius Poliorcetes at a battle off Cyprus in 306 BC, and that Antignos, the father of Poliorcetes, had ships of 11 and 12 banks. We have seen, however, that Diodorus died about 2.5 centuries after this period. Pliny, who lived from 61 to 115 AD, increases the number of banks in the ships of the opposing fleets at this battle to 12 and 15 banks respectively. It is impossible to place any confidence in such statements. Theophrastus, a botanist who died about 280 BC and was therefore a contemporary of Demetrius, mentions in his History of Plants that the king built an 11-bank ship in Cyprus. This is one of the very few contemporary records we possess of the construction of such ships. This question, however, arises. Can a botanist be accepted as an accurate witness in matters related to shipbuilding? The further question presents itself. What meaning is intended to be conveyed by the terms which we translate as the ships of many banks? This question will be reverted to hereafter. In one instance, a writer cites a document in which one of these many-bank ships is mentioned as having been in existence during his lifetime. The author in question was Polybius, one of the most painstaking and accurate of the ancient historians, who was born between 214 and 204 BC, and who quotes a treaty between Rome and Macedon concluded in 197 BC, in which a Macedonian ship of 16 banks is once mentioned. The ship was brought to the Tiber 30 years later, according to Plutarch and Pliny, who are supposed to have copied a lost account by Polybius. Both Plutarch and Pliny were born more than 2 centuries after this event. If the alleged account by Polybius had been preserved, it would have been unimpeachable authority on the subject of this vessel, as this writer, who was about the period in exile in Italy, was tutor in the family of Aemilius Paulus, the Roman general who brought the ship to the Tiber. The Romans first became a naval power in their wars with the Carthaginians, when the command of the sea became a necessity of their existence. This was about 256 BC. At that time, they knew nothing whatever of shipbuilding, and the early war vessels were merely copies of those used by the Carthaginians, and those latter were no doubt of the same general type as the Greek galleys. The first Roman fleet appears to have consisted of quinqueremes. 3rd century BC is said to have been an era of gigantic ships. Ptolemy Philadelphos and Ptolemy Philopator, who reigned over Egypt during the greater part of that century, are alleged to have built a number of galleys ranging from 13 up to 40 banks. The evidence in this case is derived from 2 unsatisfactory sources. Athenaeus and Plutarch quote one Calixenos of Rhodes, and Pliny quotes one Philistephanos of Cyrene, but very little is known about either Calixenos or Philistephanos of Cyrene. Fortunately, however, Calixenos gives details about the size of the 40-banker, the length of her longest oars, and the number of her crew, which enables us to gauge his value as an authority and to pronounce his story to be incredible. Whatever the arrangement of their oars may have been, These many-bank ships appear to have been large and unmanageable, and they finally went out of fashion in the year 31 BC when Augustus defeated the combined fleets of Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium. The vessels which composed the latter fleets were of the many-banked order, while Augustus had adopted the swift, low, and handy galleys of the Liburni, who were a seafaring and piratical people from Illyria on the Adriatic coast. Their vessels were originally single bankers, but afterwards it was said that two banks were adopted. This statement is borne out by the evidence of Trajan's column, all the galleys represented on it, with the exception of one being biremes. Augustus gained victory at Actium largely owing to the handiness of his Liburnian galleys, and in consequence this type was henceforth adopted for Roman warships, and ships of many banks were no longer built. The very word trireme came to signify a warship, with reference to the number of banks of oars. After the Romans had completed the conquest of the nations bordering on the Mediterranean, naval war ceased for the time, and the fighting navy of Rome declined in importance. It was not till the establishment of the Vandal kingdom in Africa under Genseric that a revival in naval warfare on a large scale took place. No changes in the system of marine architecture are recorded during all these ages. The galley considerably modified in later times, continuing to be the principal type of warship in the Mediterranean till about the 16th century of our era. Finally, we transition to ancient merchant ships. Little accurate information as we possess about the warships of the ancients, we know still less of their merchant vessels and transports. They were unquestionably much broader, relatively, and fuller than the galleys, for whereas the length of the latter class was often 8 to 10 times the beam, the merchant ships were rarely longer than 3 or 4 times their beam. Nothing is known of the nature of Phoenician merchant vessels. Figure 12 is an illustration of an Athenian merchant ship of about 500 BC. It is taken from the same painted vase as the galley shown on Figure 9. If the illustration can be relied on, it shows that these early Greek sailing ships were not only relatively short, but very deep. The forefoot and deadwood aft appear to have been cut away to an extraordinary extent, probably for the purpose of increasing the handiness. The rigging was of the type which was practically universal in ancient ships. Figure 13 gives a sheer draught or side elevation, the plan, the elevations of the bow and stem, and a midship section of a Roman vessel, which from her proportions and the shape of the bow is supposed to have been a merchant ship. The illustration is taken from a model present to Greenwich Hospital by Lord Anson. The original model was of white marble and was found in the Villa Mattei in Rome in the 16th century. We know from St. Paul's experiences as described in the Acts of the Apostles that Mediterranean merchant ships must have been of considerable size, and they were capable of going through very stormy voyages. St. Paul's ship contained a grain cargo and carried 276 human beings. In the merchant ships, oars were only used as an auxiliary means of propulsion, the principal reliance being placed on masts and sails. Vessels of widely different sizes were in use, the larger carrying 10,000 talents or 250 tons of cargo. Sometimes, however, much bigger ships were used. For instance, Pliny mentions a vessel in which the Vatican obelisk and its pedestal, weighing together nearly 500 tons, were brought from Egypt to Italy about the year 50 AD. It is further stated that this vessel carried an additional cargo of 800 tons of lentils to keep the obelisk from shifting on board. Lucian, writing in the latter half of the 2nd century AD, mentions in one of his dialogues the dimensions of a ship which carried corn from Egypt to the Piraeus. The figures are a length of 180 feet, a breadth of nearly 50 feet, the depth from the deck to the bottom of hold being around 443.5 feet. The latter figure appears to be incredible. The other dimensions are approximately those of the Royal George, which is described on page 126. Details of the construction of Greek and Roman galleys. It is only during the present century that we have learned, with any certainty, what ancient Greek galleys were like. In the year 1834 AD, it was discovered that a drain at the Piraeus had been constructed with a number of slabs bearing inscriptions, which on examination turned out to be the inventories of the ancient dockyard of the Piraeus. From these inscriptions, on account of the Attic triremes, have been derived by the German writers Boeck and Grosser. The galleys all appear to have been constructed on much of the same model, with interchangeable parts. The dates of the slabs range from 373 BCE to 323 BC, and the following description must be taken as applying only to galleys built within this period. The length, exclusive of the beak or ram, must have been at least 126 feet, the ram having an additional length of 10 feet. The length was, of course, dictated by the maximum number of oars in any one tier, by the space which it was found necessary to leave between each oar, and by the free spaces between the foremost oar and the stem, and the aftermost oar and the stern of the ship. Now, as it appears further on, the maximum number of oars in any tier on a trireme was 62 in the top bank, which gives 31 a side. If we only allow 3 feet between the oars, we must allow at least 90 feet for the portion of the vessel occupied by the rowers. The free spaces at stem and stern were, according to the representations of these vessels, which have come down to us, about 7/24 of the whole. And if we accept this proportion, the length of a trireme, independently of its beak, would be about 126 feet 6 inches. If the space allotted to each rower be increased, and it may very reasonably be the total length of the ship, would also have to be increased proportionately. Hence it is not surprising that some authorities put the length at over 140 feet. It may be mentioned in corroboration that the ruins of the Athenian docks at Zea show that they were originally at least 150 feet long. They were also 19 feet 5 inches wide. The breadth of a trireme at the waterline amidships was about 14 feet, perhaps increasing somewhat higher up. The sides tumbled home above the greatest width. These figures give the width of the hull proper, exclusive of an outrigged gangway or deck, which as subsequently explained was constructed along the sides as a passage for the soldiers and seamen. The draught was from 7 to 8 feet. Such a vessel carried a crew of from 200 to 225, of whom 174 were rowers, 20 seamen to work the sails, anchors, etc., and the remainder of whom were soldiers. Of the rowers, 62 occupied the upper, 58 the middle, and 54 the lower tier. Many writers have supposed that each oar was worked by several rowers, as in the galleys of the Middle Ages. This, however, was not the case, for it has been conclusively proved that in the Greek galleys, up to the class of triremes, and at any rate there was only one man to each oar. For instance, Thucydides, describing the surprise attack intended to be delivered on Piraeus, and actually delivered against the island of Salamis by the Peloponnesians in 429 BC, relates that the sailors were marched from Corinth to Nisaea, the harbor of Megara on the Athenian side of the isthmus, in order to launch 40 ships, which happened to be lying in the docks there, that each sailor carried his cushion and his oar with its thong on his march. We have, moreover, a direct proof of the size of the longest oars used in triremes, for the inventories of Athenian dockyards expressly state that they were 9½ cubits, or 13 feet 6 inches in length. The reason why the oars were arranged in tiers or banks, one above the other, was no doubt that in this way the propelling power could be increased without a corresponding increase in the length of the ships. To make a long sea-going vessel sufficiently strong without a closed upper deck would have severely taxed the skill of the early shipbuilders. Moreover, long vessels would have been very difficult to maneuver, and in the Greek mode of fighting, ramming being one of the chief modes of offense, facility in maneuvering was of prime importance. The rowers on each side sat in the same vertical longitudinal plane, and consequently the length of the inboard portions of the oars varied according as the curve of the vessel's side approached or receded from this vertical plane. Alright guys, that's all for part 2, and I'll see you guys next time in part 3.